Well, first of all, thanks a lot for including us in this program. This is a great opportunity to present, and I've really enjoyed the talk so far. So this is joint work with Cian Ruane, who's at the IMF, so the usual disclaimer applies. He's also here during the talk and will hopefully be able to answer any clarifying questions during the Q&A. So in this paper, we study the two-way relationship between distribution costs and the size of manufacturing plants. So what are distribution costs? Well, in order to sell anything to a consumer, manufacturers have to get the goods from the location of production to the consumer, or in other words, distribute them. And this process is costly, and in particular, we're going to think of it as entailing both variable and fixed costs. So for variable costs, think of things like literal freight and shipping charges or insurance of goods along the way. Whereas with fixed costs, what we have in mind is mostly things like finding local distributors, advertising, and building your customer network. We think that this process might be particularly interesting to study in developing countries, since these tend to have particularly low productivity in distribution sectors. So for example, the TFP gap between the US and India is around 8 in distribution sectors compared to only 4 in manufacturing. This is maybe not that surprising if we think of, this low-income countries typically having relatively poor transportation infrastructure, and in the case of India, also fairly fragmented distribution network. So in this paper, we're going to take this low productivity in distribution sectors as given and ask how that affects in turn the manufacturing sector. The basic idea is quite simple. If it's very costly to ship your goods across space, then that's going to constrain in particular large firms, since they tend to ship to more distant customers. If these large and productive firms can't serve the whole market, this is going to allow the small and low productivity firms to pop up and survive and serve these kind of more distant areas. A priori, therefore, we think that low productivity in distribution sectors could be part of the reason for why we see so many small firms in low-income countries. So what do we actually do in this paper? Well, first, we're going to bring new data to the table. We're going to use India's manufacturing census, in which plants directly report how much they spend on the goods they distribute. And to the best of our knowledge, that's a unique feature of the Indian data. So for example, in the US, in the manufacturing census, plants just report sales net of distribution expenses. We're going to document 2 facts with this data. First, distribution shares are large. On average, firms spend about 12% of their value-added costs on distributing your goods. And second, large firms spend relatively more. So a firm at the 10th percentile of the size distribution is going to spend about 5% on distributing its goods. And that number goes to almost 20% of costs for firms at the 90th percentile of the size distribution. To then think about the relationship between the manufacturing and the distribution sector, we're going to develop a simple model of heterogeneous firms that ship goods to consumers across space. Importantly, we're going to allow that in the model that shipping further distances requires more distribution services. That's going to replicate the fact that larger firms have a higher distribution share. And we're going to show you through the lens of the model that this, in fact, kind of constrained larger plants, and in general equilibrium is going to allow these small firms to pop up. Then using the data moments we document in the first part of the talk, we're going to quantify the model to 2012. And then today I'll show you kind of one preliminary quantitative exercise, since we're still waiting on some of the data to come in. And in particular, we're going to simulate the effect of the observed improvements in distribution TFP over time. And we're going to find that that improvement in distribution TFP can explain about 30% of the decline in small firm employment in manufacturing. So structure of the talk is going to be very simple. I'll start with the data, and then I'll jump into the model and show you the quantitative results. The data we use is the annual survey of industry. This is a survey of formal Indian manufacturing plants. So we're going to use, the years 1993 to 2012. What's really unique about this data is that plants are directly asked to report how much they spent on distributing their goods. And so in particular, that's going to include outward freight, rebates and commissions to intermediaries, transit insurance of goods, and packing fees. So to come back to that distinction between variable and fixed costs, we think of this as being a pretty good measure of variable costs of distributions, but it's not going to kind of tell us much about the fixed costs. The main measure we're going to look at is a firm's distribution share, which we define as its distribution costs relative to its payment on labor and capital. So really its distribution expenses as a share of its value-added costs. So here's what this looks like across the firm size distribution. So what I'm showing you here is a bin scatter of this distribution share against firm size, measured in this case as sales. So we're taking out industry and year fixed effects, so we're really comparing two firms that produce relatively similar goods. So really I want to make 2 points. First, on average, this share is large. So for the average firm, it's about 12% of its sales. And second, it's increasing in size. So a small firm spend almost nothing on distributing their goods, but that goes up to almost 20% for the largest firms in the sample. So one thing you might wonder about at this point is to what extent that's a measurement phenomenon. So one thing that could be driving this relationship, for example, is that large firms do all the distribution themselves, whereas what small firms really do is they sell at factory gate to some distributor, and that's all that we're picking up here. So of course we can't directly test that, but let me show you one piece of evidence suggesting that this is not the case. So in the ASI, the firms also report their inward distribution expenses. So how much did they spend on getting intermediate inputs into their factories? Now, if larger firms do all of their distribution in-house, then we should see the same kind of relationship between size and share on the inward side, but we actually don't. And so this fact makes us confident that we're indeed picking up some real increase in cost on the outward distribution side. The second fact that I wanted to show you is that the distribution share has been declining over time. At the same time, as I'll show you later, productivity in the distribution sector has been increasing. And this decline is significant. So between 1993 and 2011, the average share firms spent on distributing their goods fell about 30%. Okay, sorry, I'm having trouble with my slides. Okay. Let me go back here. All right, so these are the two main facts I wanted to show you. And now to understand what's kind of driving this decline in the distribution share and how that affects firms of different sizes, we're going to turn to the model. Let me give you a quick overview of what the model is, and then I'll have just sort of one slide giving you the main building blocks in the interest of time. So basically what we're going to have is Mellitz meets Arkolakis in continuous space. So we have a model of heterogeneous consumers and firms that are distributed across space. And the focus of the model really is on these firms that are going to choose which consumers to sell to and how much to sell to each consumer. Selling to a consumer or a particular location involves both a fixed and a variable cost of distribution. And we're going to allow for this distribution cost to be increasing in the distance from the location of production to the sale location. What that's going to give us in the model is that high productivity firms sell more, reach more distant customers, and because they reach more distant customers, on average, have a higher distribution share. This relationship between size and distribution share is what we're going to match to the data, and that's what's going to help us identify the main parameters governing kind of how quickly variable costs rise with distance. The main mechanism we're after then is how does low productivity in the distribution sector affect these manufacturing firms? And here the mechanism is going to be relatively simple. If it is more costly kind of to ship your goods in partial equilibrium, firms are going to sell to a smaller set of customers. In particular, the large firms are going to be more constrained. And that's going to allow in general equilibrium for low productivity or small guys to kind of pop up and serve the market. So we're going to write down a model with two sectors, a distribution and a manufacturing sector. The distribution sector is super simple. There's going to be perfect competition and a linear technology. And that's going to directly pin down the price of these distribution services that are used as an intermediate input in manufacturing, one for one with this exogenous productivity AD. The manufacturing sector is a little bit more interesting. There's going to be monopolistic competition here between heterogeneous firms that differ in terms of the quality psi of the good they produce. The geography we're going to assume here is really very simple. And in particular, we're going to assume that India is a circle around which consumers are uniformly distributed. Firms then draw a level of productivity or quality psi, and upon observing this productivity, they choose whether or not to enter. They choose where to produce, and then how much to sell and how much to charge in each particular market and along the circle to maximize profits. What are profits here? Well, firms make revenues, pay their workers, pay for distribution, for variable and for fixed distribution expenses. Consumers here see as preferences, which just imply a standard downward sloping demand curve that faces the firm in each particular location. Production here is linear, and in particular, we assume that there's no difference in terms of TFP across firms. Each firm can produce kind of 1 unit of physical good with 1 unit of labor. In order to sell 1 unit of output Q in market N, firm also need to spend on distribution expenses D, and these are going to be, in general, increasing in the distance as long as epsilon is positive. In addition, in order to reach each given market N, firms have to spend a fixed cost equal to F of N. Here, that's the Arkolakis formulation. That's going to capture, things like finding your customer base or finding your distributors. After choosing kind of its optimal sales in each market, firms are going to choose how many of these markets to reach. So what's the furthest distance they want to go? What's kind of built into the setup of the model is that as long as epsilon and beta are positive, further markets N are more costly to sell to. And now the more productive a firm is, the higher its quality psi, the larger profits it's going to make in each of the markets. And so therefore it's going to find it profitable to sell to more distance consumers. So really the model boils down to 3 key parameters that we're going to have to infer from the data. One being the productivity of the distribution sector, which affects the price, then epsilon and beta. The productivity of the distribution sector, AD, really governs kind of on average how expensive it is to get your stuff out. Epsilon then is going to govern how fast these distribution expenses rise with distance, whereas beta is going to govern this fixed cost, how expensive is it to set up in new markets. And this is really where the new data is going to be super helpful. So by observing kind of a lot of detail about the variable cost of firms, we're going to be able to infer the productivity of distribution and this epsilon much more directly than kind of typical trade models. And this is what I'm going to kind of tell you now. So the idea behind a quantitative model now is that we're going to calibrate these 3 main parameters, so epsilon, beta, and the productivity of the distribution sector, to the year 2012 to match kind of 3 key parameters, which are the average and aggregate distribution shares of sales. So that's kind of based on those figures that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. And then we also, in order to know how far do firms actually go conditional on paying that price, we need some measure of how far they sell to. Unfortunately, we don't have kind of very detailed information on that, but we're going to use a more macro moment, namely the interstate trade share within India. What we're then going to do with the model is feed in the productivity of the distribution sector going back in time. The reason we kind of calibrate it to the end and then go back in time is because for now, we only have the interstate trade data actually for 2017. We have purchased historical records and they're on the way, but COVID has slowed everything down. But once we have that, we'll be able to estimate it over time. But for today, I'm going to show you if I feed in just this decline in productivity increase in productivity over time, what does the model predict for the distribution share and the interstate trade share? And then as a second step, what would it predict for changes in the firm size, distribution, and aggregate welfare? And then I'm going to conclude by just briefly contrasting that to a model in which, a model that we might have written down if we didn't have this data on the relationship between distribution costs and size. So we're going to assume that productivity, this psi, follows a log normal distribution. So that gives us 4 main parameters to pin down. Now, of course, everything is jointly identified, but here I've roughly arranged the parameters based on which moment is kind of most informative for which parameter. So we're going to choose the productivity of the distribution sector to match an average distribution share of about 10% in 2012. So that's saying that 10% of costs on average go to this intermediate input. Then conditional on the average, the aggregate is informative about how much more large firms spend on distributing their goods. And so the difference between aggregate and average is what's going to identify epsilon, the slope of this cost. Beta, this was kind of the rate at which fixed costs increase with distance, is going to be mostly informed by the interstate trade share. And then we're going to just pin down the TFP dispersion to match the observed standard deviation of costs in the data. The firm moments are from the ASI in 2012. And as I mentioned before, right now we're using the interstate trade share from 2017 because that's what we have data on for now. And hopefully we'll be able to go back in time once we have the new data. One quick thing before I show you the results. Reassuringly, the model fits the slope of the distribution side cost with respect to size relatively well. So if I run Thank you, Robert. If I run a regression in model and data of the distribution share on log sales, I'm going to recover a relatively similar coefficient of 0.02 relative to 0.03 in the data. So now that I've quantified the model, I can show you our main exercise, which is going to be to feed in this observed decline in productivity of the distribution sector. So this measurement comes from Clem, so this is kind of an external data set. And here I'm just showing you what they predict was the increase in productivity of distribution sectors. So these are transportation and trade sectors from 93 to 2012. And as I'm kind of showing you on the top left here, productivity in these sectors increased by about 50%. The three other plots now show you what our model predicts for the three other moments we used to calibrate it, and compares that to the data. So let's start with the top right. The model actually, just by feeding in this increase in productivity in the distribution sector, fits the decline in the distribution share remarkably well. So remember, in 2011, model and data are going to cross by construction, but the model is able to predict kind of in terms of magnitudes remarkably well that decline in the average distribution share from about 14 to 10%. On the bottom left, we show you the same on that aggregate. So there are more fluctuations kind of in the data that we can't fully pick up. And on average, our model sort of predicts a little bit more of an effect on the aggregate. The bottom right now is where we're still kind of missing the data, but but here the model predicts that because it has become cheaper to kind of sell across space, and we have that mechanism that affects the large firms more, we see that the intrastate trade shares should have increased over that time, and India has become kind of a more open economy. Okay, so now let me move on to showing you what that does to firm size. So between 1994 to 2009, the prevalence of small firm has been going down. So we're measuring small firms here as the share of firms with less than 5 workers. And while that was about 63% of manufacturing firms in 1994, that went down to about 58% by 2009. And our model, just by feeding in that kind of observed increase in productivity in the distribution sector, is able to explain about 30% of that decline in employment in small firms. Now, why do we care about employment in small firms? Well, first of all, I think this is sort of a puzzle in the macro development literature in and as of itself. But secondly, of course, in this model, that comes with large welfare gains. We're relocating employment towards larger and more productive businesses, and welfare actually increases by 9%. Now let me quickly sort of contrast this to a world, to a model that we might have written down if we didn't have data on that relationship between firm size and the distribution share. So if we didn't kind of have data to discipline that, we might have written down a model in which distribution expenses are like any other intermediate input, and firms kind of spend proportionally on this. Like, yes, larger firms spend more than on distributing their goods, but it's roughly 12% for everyone in the economy. So more concretely, what we do is we re-estimate, we set the slope of the distribution costs with respect to distance to 0 and re-estimate all other parameters to fit the same moment. And as I'm showing you here, in a world where where all firms spend equally on distributions, all firms are roughly equally affected by low productivity in distribution sectors, and that has no effect at all on the firm size distribution. Again, sort of, why do we care about this effect on small firms? Well, what's going on here is that because of the size dependence, because larger firms are relatively more affected by low productivity in the distribution sector, that parameter is going to affect firm selection. So what I'm plotting here is the cutoff firm TFP. So that's sort of the least productive firm that in equilibrium is still going to be active over time, as kind of predicted by the model when I feed in the increase in productivity in the distribution sector. In our baseline model, as sort of distributing goods becomes more productive, the large firms are able to expand even more. We see an employment reallocation, and the low, really super low productivity firms are driven out. That effect is sort of not present in a model in which that was, we would have treated this as just any other input into the firm's production. And this, I think I'm more or less on time. Let me quickly conclude. So what we're kind of trying to do in this paper is first document a new stylized fact, namely that distribution services are a large component of firm costs. And it's not only a large component, it's also a fairly unusual component in that its kind of importance in the firm's cost bundle is increasing in size. So larger firms spend much more on that intermediate input. To kind of understand then the relationship between distributions and manufacturing, we wrote down a simple two-sector model in which firms sell to consumers and incur a distribution expense. And we showed you that in the model, we can easily kind of replicate this fact that distribution costs increase in distance. This relationship in the data, this relationship in the model combined with the data that we bring to the table allowed us to then kind of back out how much more costly it is to sell across space. And with that, we performed some kind of simple quantitative results and showed you that, just with an increase in productivity in the distribution sector observed in the aggregate data from the 90s to 2012, we can explain roughly 30% of the decline in small firm employment and find a welfare increase about 9%. And so I'm going to conclude this by kind of emphasizing one more time that the size dependence of this input is really crucial, and that's why it's maybe kind of an intermediate input we should be sort of spending more time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alessandra. Fascinating stuff. Who would like to open the discussion here? Yeah, Christina.
This is super interesting. Thank you for presenting it. When you first started explaining the setup, my first intuition was that what's going to happen is that in every state, there is going to be relatively larger firms popping up who are not the most productive in the same sector as the most productive inside the whole country. And so they are going to be taking over the sales of the most productive, most productive firm inside the country. And as the distribution sector becomes more productive, the best in the country, the most productive in the country is going to sell everywhere across all the states. And so do you, other than the implication on the share of small and productive firms, do you also see after the distribution sector becomes more productive, do you also see that larger firms that used to sell in individual states are now taken over by the best firm, the most productive firm in the country, and therefore sales become more concentrated?
Should I just answer that, Robert, or should we?
Yeah, well, then maybe we collect a few if there's others who want to. Ethan, you want to?
Yeah, I have a sort of unfair question. I like this setup and I like this model a lot. I have the impression, the sort of hard-earned impression in India that sometimes it's really hard to move goods around, but that if you can do it by rail, it may be really efficient. And India moves huge amounts of goods by rail at a rather low cost. So if I were going to think about adapting this model to that, I might have a sort of multimodal distribution system, I guess. So this is completely unfair. How do you think that would change things, and is that a worthwhile innovation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, Kemu.
Hi, very nice paper. I was just wondering what you would get from like a simpler model that's not as rich. So like just take a Melitz model and just have the iceberg cost be a function of the firm size, and then just in some reduced form way, and then you can implement the productivity improvement by changing the nature of that. You can implement the productivity improvement in the distribution sector by changing the nature of that relationship. So it's just a very crude, reduced form way of, simpler version of your model. And I just wanted to know what that would yield compared to what your model would yield. Thanks.
Okay, further points to raise?
Otherwise, I can start answering them, and then
please do.
We can do another round. Yep. So, Christina, let me make sure I understood your question. So it seems like you were asking that, another implication of this should be that sales become more concentrated, and that now, maybe somebody was the biggest player in one state, but as it becomes cheaper to sell everywhere, they kind of start to dominate the whole market. Like that's exactly what the model predicts. That's sort of behind, I kind of showed you the results on the lower end, but that's kind of exactly what's driving this. So unfortunately, we don't, like pre-2017, I think we don't have data on kind of sales crossing borders for now. So we can't really look at it in the data, but in the model, that's definitely there. So it's interesting you bring up the rail, because that's exactly the data that we're waiting to get. So India doesn't record interstate trade back in time, except for railway trade. So that's the data that's kind of on our way to us, and then we'll be able to kind of tell you, first of all, how does it compare in the years where we have, in the very few years where we have other trade, is it true that kind of much more goes by rail? And then we'll be able to kind of calibrate it to that. Now, to the extent that that's the one mode of transport that works really well and is efficient, we would be kind of understating how big of an issue kind of that is. But that's so right now the way I would think of it is that we're sort of modeling the minimal. So we're not modeling the different transportation modes separately, but in a way, kind of the firm has already taken the minimum over it. But it might be interesting to dig into that, but that's going to probably be a data constraint.
Thank you.
And then in terms of the simpler model, so in a way, that's actually exactly what we wrote down. So what we wrote down is mellets in continuous space. So you have both that the iceberg cost, the tau, kind of continuously increases in distance, and the fixed cost, which is usually, if you think of a two-country setting, it's one number. But now once you have a continuum, it's many numbers. So in a way, I think I've kind of, put some try to illustrate this a bit more, but in a way that's exactly what we do. So I think if you were to just relabel a few things in the model, then that would boil down to exactly what you suggested, this sort of reduced form model. So I think Joe.
Hi, I just trying to draw some connections across these theme workshops. In the theme 1 firm workshop, there was a paper by Meredith Starts and Matt Grant on cutting out the middlemen and intermediary chains that I thought was interesting and potentially relevant. And I think probably coming up in the agriculture and trade spatial frictions, there will be some relevant research. And then I just thought that there's also a large literature in economic history that talks about the importance of intermediation costs for the scaling up of firms and establishments. So just wanted to recommend those to you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. I have not yet looked at Meredith's paper, Meredith and Matt's paper, but I'll do that. Yeah, like I think I remember talking to Nick Bloom about this and him saying that sort of one of Stahle's view of the birth of the big corporations in the US was the development of the railway system. So there's definitely a connection to that more historical literature. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for this discussion and these first 2 excellent papers.